Hi, and welcome to the Peoria Riverfront Museum. I am Bill Conger, museum curator, and with me is guest curator Bill Heydrich, who has provided for us an amazing exhibition called Rodin, Cast in Bronze, the Work of Many Hands. And we are here together so Bill can kind of enlighten us on the amazing works that are in this show.
It's great to be here, Bill, and it was a lot of fun putting this exhibition together. It was great to work with you and fun to bring out the museum's pieces, the three in particular that we were interested in, the Rodin, the Saint-Gaudens, and the Remington, are all works that were cast in multiple examples, and the circumstances around their creation is different from each other. And in talking with the museum, I thought it would be a good idea to try to explore those circumstances and consider them in a larger historical light. Look at what's gone on before, what has been acceptable or unacceptable practices in the creation of these works. And one of the most important things to remember is that as these works were created, no artist just sat down by himself, had an idea, and got right to the finished piece. There may be an example or two that might be that, but more than likely, this was an awful lot of work. Casting in bronze is much more expensive than carving in marble. So you had to be very careful, thoughtful, and considerate of all the different aspects of making these things. And then, of course, one of the other things that's emerged with this exhibition is that it's an opportunity for us to look at, I will go so far as to say that I think it's the most important tradition in all of art, and that is the depiction of the human body in Western art.
Well, it is fascinating, the amount of works that are in this show, not overwhelming, less than 20, around 20 works.
Sure.
And I believe that one of the most amazing parts about it is that when a viewer thinks about bronze, they think about a bronze sculpture, they have an image in their mind. When you walk into this exhibition, there are so many textures and colors and patinas that we are reminded bronze is not just bronze. Bronze is just a medium to achieve a result. And
Right.
I think that is an overwhelming part of the exhibition.
Let's have a look.
Let's go to the Rodin. So this is the work that you chose to kind of conceptually tie the show around, or at least entitle
Yes.
Rodin. This is the museum work, the Danaid, which is the daughter of it's a Greek mythological story, and this daughter was one of 50 who attempted some horrible things on their husbands. They were attempting to kill their husbands, and as a result, getting caught, her father has doomed her to a life of gathering water, a process that will never be completely fulfilled, and we see her collapse. And the first thing I'm struck with, Bill, is the emotional quality that Rodin is able to kind of evoke through the manipulation of bronze here.
It's a great work, and it's one that the museum is justifiably proud to have. What I like about it is that it does evoke the power of Rodin's great works. He was a prolific artist, one that was not necessarily edited. In fact, when his estate went to the French government, they gained control over the continuing production of these works. In the beginning, they set for themselves a limit of 10 casts per object. And they cast some things that Rodin may or may not have intended to have cast. We don't know.
Right.
Most anything that he touched, he likely would have gotten around, I think, to having it cast in bronze. We're fortunate that 30 years ago, we had the wonderful Rodin exhibition here at Lakeview Museum. And as a gesture towards the Bielefelds, who did so much for that exhibition, the Cantors gave this wonderful piece.
Amazing. 1987 was the gift, but the exhibition 1988.
Yes.
And truly a milestone in the museum's history.
Yeah. And it is a very powerful work. And in the context of the power of this work, it's important to remember that Rodin was profoundly influenced by the work of Michelangelo. And in Paris, at the Louvre, are those wonderful sculptures of the dying slave that are very powerful. They seem to be trying to free themselves from the stone. Now, in that context, one of the interesting correspondences that we see in the history of Western art, the tradition depicting the human form, is if we go over here for a moment to this gilt corpus of the deceased Christ by Guglielmo della Porta. It's a work of the late 16th century, and fortunately for us, it preserves its original surfaces. And what we see here is another emotive figure. The writhing torso is so powerful, so expressive of the anguish and suffering that Christ experienced. It ties us right to Rodin.
Absolutely.
We might think of Rodin as being so modern and so, of this moment, but he, in fact, is drawing from the same source as Della Porta. Della Porta was a contemporary of Michelangelo, outlived him. Della Porta would be the sculptor in Rome who had his 15 minutes of fame after Michelangelo died. He was alive, and before another artist who's not particularly well known, Giambologna, emerged on the scene. So for a little moment there, about a 10-year period, Della Porta was the sort of go-to guy in Italy. He was the top dog. And this is a lovely, lovely corpus. And it's particularly interesting in that there are many of these. In fact, this seems to derive for the great gold corpus that Della Porta did for the Vatican. At the most important ceremonies performed at the Vatican, the processional cross, which is large and solid gold, was made by Della Porta. Amazing. These relate to each other. They're very similar to each other. Years after Della Porta's death, his nephew inherited all of the molds, the models, what have you, and he continued to produce them. This gets to be one of the problems with when there's some of these things made and under what circumstances, who has authority, who doesn't have authority. We find, though, a very interesting legal case in which someone stole from Della Porta's heirs one of the actual models, a deposition, took it to Spain and got busy making depositions. There's a lot of them. He was taken to court, and the issue settled at court was that the models had in fact been stolen. So the heirs got the models back, but there was not any issue about copyright and whether or not it was okay for them to be manufacturing lots more of these sculptures. So they got away with that.
Absolutely.
But it makes it very difficult later on in time to sort out a lot of these things.
And hard for us to kind of think about those issues today.
Yes.
When copyright and image control is a major part of our world.
And it just speaks to that issue of how is the artist's original idea conveyed to us?
Amazing.
How does it get to us today?
300 years span the Danaid
at least
to the Della Porta, and there are similarities, the taut musculature, the kind of writhing, the emotional, which is the connection.
Right. And of course, it comes from Michelangelo.
Amazing.
Both artists looking at Michelangelo, one a contemporary, one hundreds of years later.
Amazing.
But it speaks to the power of his achievement as one of the most impactful artists of all time. I'm just finishing the book on Leonardo, and I'm now more convinced that he was the great genius. They were all geniuses, but Michelangelo had a much greater impact because he did a lot of work and people saw it. Nobody saw Leonardo's work.
Phenomenal.
Little was finished.
Phenomenal.
To sort of get with the idea of the human figure, let's look at the earliest piece
I love this
in the
piece.
exhibition.
I love this work.
A marble torso, probably from the 2nd century AD. I would hazard the further guess that it's likely from the eastern side of the Mediterranean.
Okay.
We're aware of, now this could be the circumstances of differential preservation of archaeological remains, but we are aware of workshops that existed in the eastern Mediterranean, one in particular at Rhodes, that produced these very fine, exquisite sculptures in antiquity. And if you look carefully at this piece, you'll see that it also preserves its original surfaces, which had been polished. A lot of the polish doesn't make it over time.
Is that right?
It degrades in the ground. Marble is much softer than people recognize.
Sure.
You handle it a lot, and the acids from your hands can get into it and
It will just
ruin it.
deteriorate
It begins
by
to
a
deteriorate.
natural process.
Yes, and if it's in ground, say like what we have here, it'll deteriorate very rapidly. Or in Italy, probably, I'll bet it was found somewhere in northern Africa, likely in the sand. One of the reasons we know it's Hercules is Hercules was often depicted with a band around his head, and then these little ribbons would come out like this over his shoulders.
Okay.
And as you can
Here we
see,
can
there
see
are
them.
traces of those on his shoulders. Now, at this point in time, Rome stands on the heritage of Greece, the investigation of the human anatomy going back hundreds of years before this piece, that it's I hate to use the word formulaic, but these guys really know how to deal with the human figure.
Sure.
And this is an element, this sense of the human figure, where they're so capable of making many of these things without much trouble. This gets lost with the collapse of antiquity. Yes, the pieces are sort of around, but it isn't until a story later on, which we'll touch on in a moment, that people and artists begin to look at these sculptures again and seek inspiration. And in this instance, it's a direct relationship between something from antiquity to the Renaissance.
Amazing.
And of course, we'll talk about the Renaissance in a minute, but it is French for renaissance, rebirth. And it's a rebirth of classicism. And it starts with one of these.
Amazing. Do we know, given this section, what the entirety of the sculpture might have looked like?
Yes, we have an idea. Actually, he was most likely sort of seated. It's not fully seated, but sort of resting on a slight bench-like feature.
Okay.
And it would have included his whole body.
Amazing. Absolutely gorgeous.
Let's take a look at another one of the museum's pieces.
The Frederick Remington, the infamous Bronco Buster.
Yes. Of course, it's the one that even he recognized when he first made it that he was on to something.
This was the hit.
This guaranteed his success for the rest of his life. And what a powerful figure it is. It reminds us too of the Rodin, the energy, the movement, the excitement, the passion.
Right.
All of those feelings, and roughly contemporary, of course, with the Rodin. But we see this great interest in the human figure, in action, dynamic movement combined with the horse, a beautiful cast. Now, we know a fair amount about Remington's working methods because he was successful, and his works were highly sought after during his lifetime. He was an overnight success. In fact, one of the first ones of these, one might argue, one of the two best casts, if not the best cast, he gave to Teddy Roosevelt. In his work, highly sought after, very successful foundry, where once he had worked out the models, assistants did the work. We went into trouble when it appears that some of the assistants at various times, realizing what a wonderful thing they had going, they didn't turn the furnaces off at night. A few more might have been made not quite under the full authority of the artist or the foundry itself. Those tend not to be marked in any way. Remington was fairly good at marking them, and the numbers are sequential so we can sort out when the official ones were made.
Absolutely.
And this is an official one made during the lifetime of his widow after he had died.
Correct.
Now, does this cause us concern? I don't think so. It's the same people, it's the same molds making these things, and they're following the playbook that was already well established for making these. We do detect minor variations, and it is possible with connoisseurship, to identify and see some of the modest changes that evolve, and quite naturally.
Deterioration of the molds over
Yes,
time,
and
slightly.
different approaches to aftercasting and finishing them off. There are quite a few of these today, and you can see them in most museums, and there are places still making them. they don't look like this. This is a nice one.
Strikes me, Bill, as a most kind of American piece because of its bravado and that kind of energy that you spoke of before, and the concept of rider and horse, which had been done obviously throughout the Renaissance and probably before, of leaders on their horse kind of nonchalantly standing in power, just kind of trotting compared to this.
Yeah, very, very good point. Because the others, the more traditional, they were portraits of individuals, and they were meant to be power figures, to communicate this lofty authority and power of an individual. And Remington has gone in an entirely different direction and created something altogether new.
Absolutely.
And it seems so fitting and tied to the American West and all the excitement of it.
It's amazing work.
Shall we look at the museum's other piece that we wanted to
absolutely
focus on?
Augustus Saint-Gaudens, which is portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson. Is he on his deathbed or is he reclining in work? I've seen contrary descriptions of this piece.
At that moment, he wasn't on his deathbed. He was sickly. He was ill quite a bit, and St. Gaudens chose to depict him writing in bed. I think it's a good idea. It's a clever idea to do it that way because the composition lends itself quite well to the circular format, the tondo work. And at that time, St. Gaudens was certainly the foremost American sculptor, one of the foremost sculptors in the world. It's a great thing. It's a wonderful depiction of him, and it also brings up some other interesting, challenging questions about the fabrication of the work. This was not done during St. Gaudens' lifetime, and the molds ended up in the hands of a dealer who then, under his own authority, made some of these. We'll find with another work in the exhibition how that happened over time, and this is not an unusual practice.
Sure.
Oftentimes, possession is 9/10 of everything, so you can kind of do what you want. But there are different aspects of this. One of the things that I thought would be interesting to include with this is to show and also bring up another issue of how certain ideas can be transmitted, and that is these two gold coins that were designed by St. Gaudens for the U.S. Mint. Teddy Roosevelt knew St. Gaudens and asked him to submit designs for 3 coins, only 2 of which were realized, and we see them here. One for the U.S. $20 gold piece and the U.S. $10 gold piece. Of course, issues of manufacture and dissemination of the ideas, I mean, here you are with a mint. There are millions of these out there.
Absolutely.
So if you look at a limited edition, it's
and of course,
hundreds of millions.
Coins are by matter of being a coin, a tondo. They are in that circular format. So what was the connection to that anti-rectilinear construct that St. Gaudens was attached to, do you think?
Well, I don't think it was an attachment or not an attachment. I think he was a genius. And he did well in this format. I particularly like the Indian 10, as it's called. And that Indian looks like a Greek or Roman god. No Indian I've ever seen, but be that as it may, that's sort of the nature of how things were done at that time.
Almost
there was a lack of cultural sensitivity to the cultural particulars weren't important.
Phenomenal.
It really is. And it's sort of a nice contrast to this prize medal awarded in 1865 by the artist, designed by Antoine Vecht. Complicated process of fabrication.
The electrotype.
Yes. Which is a wet chemical process in which you have a mold and you run electricity through the water and you put in metal ingots, and the electricity will activate the metal and move it over to the mold, and it'll eventually build up to form this design. one of the nice things about it is especially truthful to the original model, and the model doesn't tend to break down much. So you get this just astonishing detail.
And this process would have been used not only in medallions, but maybe vessels.
Yes,
cups,
it's used, yes, in silver, metalware.
Yeah.
It's great for creating wonderful details, but also getting different metals on other metals, so you can create lots of different things with that.
It's a phenomenal piece and a phenomenal finish. The patina on this electrotype is just beautiful.
It's very pretty.
Yeah, it really is.
And I don't know who Amanda Salt is that won it, which I think is
Yeah.
striking. I mean, that's quite a medal to win.
It really
I
is.
think.
It really
I'd
is.
be happy to receive it.
What would you like to take a peek at?
Should we go look at? Let's look at Daumier in a minute. I want to talk about the Berthelot over here,
Sure.
Cleopatra. She's with Cupid. She dates to the early 1600s. A beautiful, beautiful bronze, French bronze, from a time when there's not a lot of art being produced in France. Sadly, much of Berthelot's work was destroyed. So it's not the strongest attribution in the world to Berthelot. It's on the basis of what little information we have
Sure.
that it's given to Berthelot. This, though, brings up the issue of this conceivably is a work that, if it's by Berthelot, he did from beginning to end.
Amazing.
We know of no other casts of this particular model. Berthelot, we do know, though, he had a workshop, so it's unlikely, in my mind, that he did it alone.
Right.
But it's a possibility where an artist maybe isn't that active. He may have been able to manage the process all the way through, but likely not. It's also a question of, is this a director, is it a unique cast or not? A puzzling thing is the only bronzes we have showing Cleopatra's suicide and little Cupid to the side are this one and one produced by a contemporary artist, contemporary to Berthelot.
Okay.
We have, I think, we know of 7 or 8 of those. Why?
A trendy
At that moment, why?
concept at that moment, apparently.
I don't know why. We don't know why.
Yeah.
What is possibly of interest here is that Marie de Medici was Berthelot's patroness, and she was run out of France. And it may be at that juncture that perhaps the idea, Cleopatra killing herself, the noble deed, Marie de Medici falling on the sword by leaving France. She didn't fall on the sword, but it might, I've wondered if it's tied somehow that way.
Amazing. Can you describe for me the unique patina on this work, how it would have been achieved?
Well, this is a varnish that would have been put on there, derived from, it's like a lacquer, and what's so pretty about it is, even when it's worn some, it's taken on a very warm brown color.
Absolutely.
So that the overall effect is quite engaging because it modulates a little bit.
Right.
And because it still preserves so much of that original lacquer, it's quite shiny.
It creates a depth to even the smooth
Yes.
parts of the
Yes.
sculpture, which is just phenomenal.
And I think it's remarkable, the sculpture itself derives from antiquity. It's close to any number of marble Venuses, which might have been known to Berthelot. But Berthelot's taken it a step further, including the asp for the suicide, which is a wonderful narrative element, and including the Cupid, which in mourning, which could likely also refer to the death of Mark Antony, her lover.
Okay.
So it's a wonderful look back at antiquity in terms of subject matter, but also in terms of the style with which it is done. I wish we knew more. In time, I think we will.
It's mysterious, fascinating, and beautiful at the same time. As we move, which direction would you like to move?
We brought up some issues about let's look at the Daumier.
Honoré Daumier.
We have the 4 prints, which have been given to the museum.
Absolutely.
Would you comment on those?
I would. Well, the prints are a wonderful way to kind of introduce the bust that is presented here with Daumier. But Daumier, of course, was a phenomenal satirist, caricature artist, political cartoonist, and has produced thousands of these variations of these cartoons throughout his career. They would be printed in newspapers and literally almost daily be handed out. He communicated to the masses through an extraordinary artistic ability, and I know that he began as a painter, was never quite accepted into the hierarchy of the painting realm, and ended up making a massive mark in his own way through these stylistically maneuvered portraits and interactions between people. And apparently no caste, no gender, no class escaped his ability to, kind of parody and create satire. So
we see that in these prints. See, lots of people getting lampooned. Absolutely. Nobody was safe.
No one was safe with Daumier. The ability through just minor and minimal gesture and mark making to create emotion in a portrait is equaled in the bronze, I think.
Yeah. The bronze is a really wonderful thing, and this is probably one of his most favorite subjects to lampoon, and that was anything related to the law, the judiciary, lawyers. He just didn't give those guys a break. And he created a number of clay models, caricatures of different significant people. I think there were 36 of these, sort of an informal set of caricature busts.
Right.
Was that exactly how many he wanted to do? We don't know. What's interesting, though, is none were cast in bronze during his lifetime. And it wasn't until he died in 1879, these weren't cast until the late 1920s, when the then owner of them saw an opportunity. It's a little troublesome. The then owner realized that some of the models had degraded.
Right.
So
right.
He had some of them fixed up. This one, though, seems to be, we think, fairly faithful to an original that was likely not altered much.
Would the casting of those works have destroyed those works?
No. They just weren't well taken care of.
Okay.
The mold making could damage them.
Sure.
Could damage the originals, and probably did.
Right.
Because there's another set of casts that comes out, I think, about 8 years later. And in fact, those people making those casts, the last ones we know of were from about 1962. So here, almost 100 years after Daumier was around. And there's an interesting parallel with a well-known artist of that day, Degas. No bronzes were cast by Degas during, or Degas
lifetime.
did not allow any bronzes to be cast during his lifetime.
They're all
of the ones, they're all, yes, all of them were cast after his lifetime. Every single one of them. So that, what do you think? Otherwise, we wouldn't see them. And in this instance, the clays really, they're in Paris. The clays should never travel. They're very fragile. This is how we know this work. This is how the artist's intention, the artist's genius idea is now disseminated to us in a way that's sort of parallel with the mass media that Daumier used. I mean, in a way, he's sort of one of the first really modern artists to take advantage of technology and media to explore ideas, to exploit his ideas, and to disseminate them.
What I love about this work is through the medium of bronze, we add depth to the exhibition because we begin to learn about not just the artist, but the intention of collectors.
Yes, yes.
And what they attach to and what motivates them, thereby creating yet another level to the discussion about bronze within the show.
That's an interesting point.
Okay.
Let's go over here and look at this small gilt bronze over here.
Absolutely. The Bagpiper.
The Bagpiper. Very interesting little fellow we believe, by an artist named Antonio Susini. This piece probably dates to about 1600. I mentioned the artist earlier, Giambologna,
Yeah.
who is certainly not as well known as Michelangelo or Rodin. He was the artist after Della Porta who became the most important artist in Europe.
Still a massive figure.
Yes, far more important actually than Della Porta. Susini worked in Giambologna's workshop as a finisher and caster of bronzes. And he was recognized early on as one of, he was in Giambologna's workshop, he was the best finisher. In fact, I will concede that I like some of the Giambologna bronzes best, which were finished by Susini, which came later in Giambologna's workshop career. So, well, anyway, Susini goes out on his own around 1600, starts his own workshop. We look at a piece like this. We know that Giambologna never did any of these we call genre figures, somebody from everyday life. This is a figure from everyday life, a shepherd or whomever, a low-class individual playing a bagpipe. This is not high music.
This is not mythology, this is not religious, this is just a commoner.
A common guy playing a common musical instrument, nothing lofty or noble about it. There seemed to have been the emergence of a taste for these things. We'll see it again in a little bronze over here. If you think of the artist Bruegel, which would have been earlier than this, he was one who certainly popularized and brought to an extraordinarily high level subject matter of everyday life. This is also very complex. I mean, we're still sorting out what he was really up to.
Sure. Does Susini's piece, to our eyes, maybe not necessarily, but to a contemporary's eyes in that time, would it have been endowed with some of the humor that a Bruegel work would have been, kind of a biting kind of commentary on the common life?
No, I think more it's for wealthy people. It's an indulgence in an interest in their everyday man. This is no democratization of the ruling class. It's rather just their interests have now wandered in that direction. And one of the things we find here, I was mentioning Giambologna, the twisting pose of the figure owes a great debt to Giambologna. And that's the relationship which seems to continue. Did Susini take a figure from the workshop and remodel it, so to speak, this way? Giambologna stuck with the lofty issues. He didn't indulge in these sort of everyday things like this.
It is a complex kind of seating arrangement for the figure. It's not just an upright.
That's right. It's very dynamic, and you need to walk around it to see how truly complicated it is. It's a little masterpiece in my view. Now, in the workshop, when Susini died, he left all of his things to his nephew, and this was a fairly popular figure, and most of the ones we see today were produced by his heirs. They're not of the same quality. The three, shall we say, best ones are this one, which is gilt, another one which is not gilt, which is a deeded gift to the National Gallery in Washington, and then of course the one that belonged to the Medici, which is the Bargello in Florence. It is gilt. Those are the three best ones. It's remarkable to have a little fellow like this here, and that's the original gilding.
It really ignites, like it's fueled from the inside. An amazing patina on that.
And it's fun to look at something like this and to turn right over and see the Bronco Buster and that energy and that excitement, and then we still sort of think back to maybe Michelangelo and then Rodin. It's just it's wonderful how all of this stuff now begins to build together to create these really wonderful works of art.
Well, as we look at the Severo on the other side, can you give us a little insight to how the workshops would have, we've mentioned them a few times. We think of the artist in their studio like the atelier today, but these were very different modes of creating works of art, weren't they?
Yes. In particular, what's outstanding about this figure is if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York or the Frick Collection, you'll see any number of variations on this figure. And Severo may have been inspired by a contemporary artist who did some somewhat similar things, but this is Severo's invention. of those known, this seems to be the best example. Best example because the detail is so strong, the veins, the fingernails, the different hair to depict the different parts of the iconography of the individual. You get the teeth, you get the tongue, you get the eyes. It's astonishing. Severo would have had several people working for him, and as orders would have come in, he would not have probably been ultimately involved in the production of some of them later on in life. And then because it was so popular, people just continued to make them. And the casting, everything goes down from there. And
interesting.
Sometimes what would happen is someone might have made a mold of this very one to produce other ones.
Was my next question, if that actually
Yes,
happened.
it happens.
Wow.
And one of the ways you tell the difference is the ones emerging from that mold will always be smaller. They shrink. Thank goodness. But some of those would be probably better than some of the ones made by his followers 50 years later. You'd be better off going back to this and making another one. This piece, though, is further interesting in that as a Renaissance piece, I mentioned with the marble torso in the beginning.
Correct.
Those are the sorts of things that artists like Severo were beginning to look at to now get ideas for how to model the human figure.
Okay.
And that sense or awareness of antiquity, I believe, informs how he depicts the torso of this figure.
The positioning of the hand, I think you had mentioned, had taken on different contexts throughout.
Yes, good question, or good comment. Let's call them the casts we believe emanated actually from his workshop when he was there. None of them perform a function. They're just like this. And
It's amazing.
my thought is it's probably a daring parlor trick that you might have gotten one of the, if you know Venetian glass of this moment, and of course this is Ravenna, it's right next door.
Sure.
Venetian glass is the best in the world. And it's very delicate, and I think one of the ideas might have been to place a small glass
Position
on
it.
there, because it looks like it could hold something.
Phenomenal.
But in order to make them more saleable later on, people started including little items with it.
That would have been cast or separate items
Both,
as well?
cast in
Both.
and then also attached.
It's amazing.
And some of the early ones have later stuff attached to them. The life of these things is amazing, and it's fun to look at.
Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous.
Let's go, we've talked about the daily life, the interest in daily life in the early 1600s. Let's come over here to this small bronze by Barthélemy Prieur. It actually is older than the Bagpiper, probably predates it by maybe 20 some odd years. Prieur's identity, the body of work, was not really established until probably the 1970s or 1980s, which also brings us back. These things are problematic. They can be very challenging. Anyway, his work has now been established, been identified. This is a bronze for which there's no other exact duplicate. It seems to be a one-off. Yet we find the model, the form, this sort of pose, reappearing in his work. There's a wonderful one that he did of a woman milking a cow, a milkmaid. And it seems, the figures in general seem to depend on this similar original model. I think what Prieur did is he altered the original model to create these slight variants.
Oh, fascinating. It strikes me very similar to the Bagpiper in complexity, size, and in gesture as well.
This would have been a modest thing for someone to have on their desk in their cabinet.
Okay.
There's a wonderful room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which comes from Urbino, which was an intact private study. It was a very small room, so the fact that some of these aren't so big, when you see the rooms they were in, they weren't very big.
Interesting.
And I should also mention that I think that it's likely that the gilt bronze Cicini could well have been a diplomatic gift from the Medici.
Wow.
The Medici at that time controlled Cicini's work. And much as we look at this sculpture right next to the Prieur by Soldani Benzi. Soldani Benzi was another artist working, I'll say, in the Medici stable at a later date. And because they received the patronage of these individuals, and that patronage extended to having free studio space, free living quarters, lots of benefits.
Sure.
And certain property rights that other individuals in society didn't always have. So in an instance, certainly with the Cecchini, we know the Medici really controlled where the works went and often just used them in diplomatic purposes.
Okay.
At this point in time, some 120 years later, it's a little looser. Soldani Benzi has some authority to sell to other people. And what's nice about this sculpture, now we're back to classical antiquity. This is Pomona, a goddess of plenty. It was intended to be a, shall we say, souvenir, a reference to a well-known sculpture in Florence at this time.
Okay.
And when milords from England came on the grand tours, they all wanted mementos, and they were amongst the richest people in the world. And somebody like Soldani Benzi got busy providing sculptures for these individuals. Now, in some instances, they're fairly slavish copies of the ancient original or somewhat contemporary original. In this instance, Soldani Benzi's changed her a good bit, and I think in a better way. Of the 4 or so known of these, 2 of them are now actually owned by the Duke of Devonshire. One of them came from Lord Burlington, who the families intermarried. And Burlington and Devonshire were 2 of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. So that gives you an idea who's buying these
Beautiful.
things. Don't know where this came out of Scotland, but we don't know how long it's been there. And
The stories behind these sculptures really bring them to life as well. I think that their complicated past is definitely gives them life. To the structure of this sculpture, you mentioned that a little more of a classicism in this, yet I sense that there are some things being pushed here. Her foot being lifted and kind of almost walking off of the pedestal itself seems to be a modern kind of attribute. Would that be fair?
Yes. The energy of the sculpture is much greater than in the ancient original. And the casting is spectacular. Soldani Benzi was the greatest bronze caster in Europe at this time. Nobody rivaled him. And it's interesting, some of these started off as a potential commission for the Prince of Liechtenstein, a name which still resonates today. I mean, they still have a lot of money.
Right.
And Liechtenstein is still an independent principality. That got into problems, but that was sort of the impetus for the creation of this group. As it turns out, of the group that Soldani Benzi created, this is the rarest of them all. And I should also mention that he charged 50% more for ones that were clothed than naked.
It is striking, just the energy that she exudes.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. Which behind her, I see a couple of 2-dimensional works.
Yes, let's go look at the Vase while we're on the subject of classicism.
Yeah.
At that time, and this is not quite contemporary with the Soldani Benzi, but nearly. This is a bit later. The Soldani Benzi is, let's say, 1710, 1720, and this is roughly 1770. And what we see here is a preparatory drawing for a funeral monument for a fellow, Fayot de Brou, who died in 1767. Yes. And one of the interesting aspects of this is Vase was a successful sculptor at this time, so had a fairly large workshop, lots of assistants, people who could do, shall we say, the heavy lifting. We also see the intervention or the role of workshop in some of these drawings. This is quite likely the first drawing, what the French refer to as the première pensée for the whole scheme. And what Vase was selling at this point was the figure of grief, this neoclassical sculpture that looks like it could have been happy in ancient Greece or Rome.
Sure.
And we find below, barely suggested, a profile of Fayot de Brou in a medallion down here. We know of 2 other drawings where when you see them next to this, you can see quite clearly this is meticulously, beautifully, and thoughtfully rendered, and the other ones are forced and dry.
Okay.
They're assistant copies. And also with each of them, we see a gradual development of the portrait itself here. This piece was installed in a church in Paris, and during the Revolution, the church was fairly well destroyed and the monument was dismantled. Wow. The sculpture of grief can be found at the Louvre today, and the medallion, the portrait of Feuille de Breux, is at Versailles.
Wonderful. I can't help but reconnect her to our starting point of the exhibition,
yes.
The Danaid, that the same kind of bodily reaction to the stress of the moment. Is Rodin responding to the grief figure? Is he responding to Vasa?
Vasset. I think Rodin, at that point, at the point that he did this, we know he specifically responded to Michelangelo because he spoke about it, but he spent a lot of time at the Louvre, and he would have known this sculpture.
Okay.
And he would have known the other sculptures like it.
Okay.
So this again is an instance where we see in this wonderful tradition of the depiction of the human form in Western art, ongoing dialogue between different times, different generations, different individuals.
Phenomenal.
Very exciting.
Beautiful.
And we can then look at this other drawing over here, which is included. It doesn't relate to sculpture per se. It rather relates to life drawing. In this instance, the French artist Simon Vouet, the drawing dates to about 1630, we say. And the reason for including it is you can observe that it is drawn from life. Now, we think of life drawing as standard procedure in the creation of art and that it's always been there. Not the case. Life drawing in France started with Vouet, who had studied in Italy where life drawing was practiced. There were moral issues attached to the subject. Maybe the French were a little prudish, believe it or not. But Vouet brought to France an interest in life drawing, and that's really when the academy gets launched, the formal academy, and they begin to regularize things. And Vouet became first painter to the king, which was a huge job, huge job. Wow. Some of the first painters pretty much stopped painting because they had to supervise monuments and different decorative schemes and come up with new ideas for tapestries and what have you.
The sculptural presence of her just in this brief sketch is absolutely stunning. And she looks like a sculpture.
She does. She is quite sculptural, and it's a nice contrast to the torso at the other, across the way on the other side of the exhibition.
Well, Bill, this is an amazing exhibition, and we have covered just about every work. The only thing that we cannot cover is the absolute delight that one gets when encountering these works in three-dimensional realm. So we need to invite people to experience these.
And also an important point, you're not going to see this kind of an exhibition at the Art Institute or the National Gallery in Washington or the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I think that this is an unusual opportunity to see things, how they connect across countries, across the centuries, and to feel and experience this extraordinary tradition in Western art of the depiction of the human figure. It emerges out of this exhibition, which we chose to do to elucidate the circumstances surrounding those three pieces that the museum owns.
Absolutely.
And clearly, this was something we were able to develop and allow to emerge in this exhibition. So I hope everybody gets a chance to come see it.
An extraordinarily multifaceted exhibition and loaded with depth, and we thank you for it.
Sure, thank you. I
thank you
had a
very much.
great time doing it.